The agenda this week found out about a new program to assist black students facing conflicts with their public schools. We considered the federal government's legislation to legalize marijuana and got a history lesson from Neil Ferguson about the evolving power of networks. The agenda's Week in Review begins looking at the availability of quality health care in Northern Ontario. We thought we'd play a little clip here from our Ontario Hub's field producer, Jayan Jagannathan, who recently spent some time in White River, Ontario, looking into a piece about recruiting and retaining physicians there. So, Sheldon, let's run a snippet of that, and then we'll come back and chat.
We don't have a hospital here, and we only have funding for one physician. So we look to the younger ones, and anybody coming out of school, they want to have peer support for sure. Plus they want to be able to use all of their skills, which means working in a hospital. So right now we're putting ads in the newspapers, in the medical journals. But as far as going to these recruitment fairs, we just don't have the funding to do that, and we don't have the manpower.
You know, it kind of frustrates me because we're constantly neglected by the province. We're covered under an underserviced area program where we do get some funding for the clinic, but the local taxpayers pay some of the operating costs here for the clinic, and so we are penalized for living in the north.
Chuck, let's start with you. How well does that short snippet characterize the way things are in Northern Ontario?
I think it's a fair representation of a lot of things that we're seeing throughout the north. Since the inception of the Northern Ontario School of Medicine for us here in Dryden, we've seen 3 graduates gravitate to our community, and it's been a big help. It's provided us some hope for the longer term.
Let's put some numbers on this if we can. Sheldon, let's bring this up. This is from NOSM's own report to Northern Ontario from 2017. 94% of NOSM graduates who have completed both their MD and residency programs at the school are now practicing in Northern Ontario. 94%. Since 2011, more than 160 NOSM-educated family docs now practice in Northern Ontario. In 2016, NOSM contributed more than $100 million of new economic activity in the north. Approximately 92% of NOSM MD students are from Northern Ontario, and more than 90 communities participate in the education of NOSM learners. Okay, let's go to our NOSM representative here. What jumps out at you from those numbers there that you think is most instructive to know?
Well, I think it's important to put the numbers in context.
Sure.
And the 94% is accurate for those who've completed both undergrad and postgrad at NOSM. Those are a lesser percentage of all the graduates. So you can look at people who completed undergrad at NOSM or people who completed residency programs, postgraduate education at NOSM, and depending on which group you look at with which lens, you'll get different numbers. The bottom line is that NOSM has been good for Northern Ontario, and there is still a lot of work because our rural communities, particularly the remote ones and the Indigenous ones, are still very underserved. There's still a lot of work we need to do.
Understood. But Sarah Newberry, let me follow up with you. If the whole idea in setting up the Northern Ontario School of Medicine in the first place was the theory that if you train docs in the north, they'll stay in the north, apparently 94% are staying in the north. I mean, that seems to sum up a pretty good news story, isn't it?
Yeah, I think there is some good news in that. And I think to Dr. Chervin's point, that statistic of 94% that is drawn from a particular study really looks at those graduates who entered family medicine, which is roughly half of the cohort to begin with, and those that did both their undergrad and their postgrad training at NOSM, which represents really a quarter of the undergraduate cohort. Many of those are indeed staying in Northern Ontario, but they're staying largely in the urban centres in Northern Ontario, and that is important, and there's huge value in that. But to the clip that you played of Mr. Spadoni in White River, rural communities are not experiencing an influx of new graduates to our practices in the way that I think was initially anticipated. In real numbers, what the data from NOSM suggests is that somewhere between 3 and 5 physicians are entering rural practice out of NOSM's programs each year across all of Northern Ontario. And when you compare that to the real current need, which in Northwestern Ontario alone is for 56 full-time family physicians in our rural communities only, that 3 to 5 graduates per year does not come close in any way to meeting existing need.
Well, let's go to Clay Hammond, who practices in Northwestern Ontario. What can you add to what Sarah just said?
Steve, I'd like to redirect the conversation a little bit away from NOSM and the excellent job that NOSM's doing. It's a young medical school. I think what we're seeing on the ground in Northwestern Ontario, and it would be great if we could have a map of Northern Ontario to just celebrate and look at the vast geography that there is there. In Northwestern Ontario, where I am, we're seeing fewer residents over the last number of years, and I don't think this is NOSM's doing. NOSM is doing everything it can to help support the education of medical students, and perhaps we need to sort of highlight for the general population and public that medical students are undergraduates that we all educate in our rural communities primarily and bring them to a level of education where then the next step is to go on to become a resident physician. And those are the doctors that we need to see in our communities, because once they come and do their postgraduate medical education as a resident physician in our communities, we have a much greater probability of attracting them and retaining them in the work environments where they come and train. We haven't seen nearly enough for long enough time in our communities, and I think that from my point of view, the finger needs to go towards our government and how it funds the medical school to get us more residents into our rural areas.
Lieben, they say follow the money, so let's do that here. Legal Aid Ontario apparently has given $100,000 to do something about this overrepresentation of black kids among those expelled. Right. What are you putting that money to?
So the funding came through a proposal process that we went through. It's 2 organizations coming together, so Tyboo Community Health Center being the lead and Rexdale Community Health Center in the west. So we're trying to cover 2 geographical areas within the GTA. And there are kind of 3 components to the program. The first one would be the outreach and going to schools and talking to students and parents, and as Nia was saying earlier on, trying to kind of provide information awareness about negotiation skills or trying to kind of prevent certain things, encouraging and empowering parents so that they know what the school act looks like, what are their rights and responsibilities when things like this happen. There's also a component where we're doing community education around conflict resolution for both parents and students. And the most critical part is the access to legal services at the right time. We find that a lot of the parents that go through the system do not have direct access to legal services, whether it's advice, whether it's negotiation and mediation with the schools, or representation at hearings and school boards. So 3 components. We have a very good relationship with MAT Legal Services, that they are providing the legal services as well as the kind of wraparound around making sure that the negotiation with the school is happening. We're trying to bring the school board into our proactively to engage with us, and we have created an advisory committee, representative of clients, parents, students, parents, the TDSB school board representatives. We're trying to get to the Catholic school board as well, so we have some representative where we can identify some of the trends and talk about it at a higher level where there could be some policy changes or administrative changes.
Well, let's find out about that. You've told us why you think the school system still has too much systemic racism in it. Let's find out why black kids get tossed. What kinds of, in your experience, what kinds of things are black kids expelled for?
Talking back to teachers.
You get expelled for that?
Yeah, foul language. It starts all the way from just an attitude, all the way up to maybe a fight.
Well, fighting I get.
Fighting you get, but at the same time, if you're defending yourself, why should the student be expelled? And I'm not justifying fighting or anything, but there are measures. It's progressive discipline that should be engaged. We find with a lot of our cases, students who have no prior interaction with discipline are immediately being expelled due to an incident. In particular, a young lady, 15 years old, was bullied for 8 months, and she finally fought back. And after she fought back, the school sought her expulsion. And we intervened, and we were able to get her back into the school as of yesterday. But the problem is, if she didn't have the legal representation, she wouldn't have got back into that school.
Now, why would the school not have investigated that, found out about the mitigating circumstances, and then made a better decision in the first place?
That's a good question.
That's why I asked it.
I can tell you it has to do with some type of publicity around that matter. It became a high-profile issue, and I think the school was trying to protect themselves. We did do the hearing, and we did bring all those relevant factors up. How many times the student and the mother approached the school, met with principals, vice principal, and principal, even met with guidance counselors, and sought a redress. And we found that at no point we felt that they do it correctly. So that was part of the, that was part of our submissions. At the end of the day, we got the result we wanted, but there is some type of protectionism around the administration because you have hearings with trustees. Trustees are close to the superintendents and principals. So their impartiality is not there as much. So that's what we're finding. And we're finding a lot of students are getting expelled because it's too much for the teachers to deal with. Sometimes when a student comes in late all the time or is disruptive in class, instead of taking them aside or putting them in a special class that addresses those behaviors, it's a lot easier to say, you know what, you're suspended for 3 days, go home. And even in those cases, we're finding schools are not providing the parents with notice of suspension, which is the first violation of the Education Act. They're just arbitrarily saying, go home because they don't want to deal with it. They really need to step up and address what their students need in order to prevent these suspensions and expulsions from getting out of hand.
Presumably, though, there is a series of protocols that teachers or administrators or principals have to follow before a suspension happens. Isn't that the case?
It is the case, but it's not followed all the time. But I think the other thing also that is very critical is even after a discipline has taken place, and maybe there may be some valid reasons for that, it's too punitive, and it doesn't really provide any support for the parent, whether it is information or even how do we then reintegrate this student back into school at a later date. I think that's a big challenge because once a student goes through the experience of being expelled or suspended, their relationship with the school system is impacted. And in most cases, we find that then they are very likely to be dropping out of school at a later date or not engaging or not achieving academically. So I think the other part of what is not being addressed by the school system is once there is an expulsion or suspension, that's it. There's no support to the parents or to the students to see if there is any way coming back to the system to help them reintegrate. There may be attitude issues, there may be behavior issues, but it cannot be like, I was hearing a presentation yesterday. For some of the students, they feel that kind of action is like going through a criminal justice system.
Oh, yes.
Or one of the students said, I feel like I was in jail because of going through this
Well, let me follow up on that. Let's take the case you just referenced. It's kind of like a trial, isn't it? Who's the judge at the trial?
Trustees. The trustees for
the
school board.
elected trustees?
Yes.
Are they the right people to be hearing these cases?
I think they should be part of the decision making, but as I mentioned before, if the trustees have a conflict of interest because they are close with the principals of the schools and the superintendents, then their impartiality is not there.
So who should be hearing these cases?
It may have to be JPs or judges because they're more informed of the law. And in a recent case, I pointed out that procedure wasn't followed. The notice of suspension wasn't issued, and the suspension that the student was attempted to be suspended under was invalid. It was a suspension for assault, but no assault had taken place as the police investigated and found no assault took place. However, the trustees did not overturn or prevent it from going forward, and that has to do with legal issues. They're more doing it holistically, which is fine, but I think a more refined legal experts probably should be on these panels.
What if you are in jail for simple possession? In that case, do you get a pardon?
Well, what the Prime Minister has been very clear is that until the law is repealed and replaced with a new regime, it remains in effect, and we urge all Canadians to continue to obey the law. But the Prime Minister has also indicated when the new regime is in place that the Minister of Public Safety, Minister Goodall, is prepared to examine the process by which records are suspended and pardons are given for simple possession. And that's an issue that we are committed to examining and reviewing, but at the appropriate time. And that cannot take place until the new legislation is in place and the existing law is repealed. And in other jurisdictions, and I would point out California recently made announcements about their intention, but with respect to some certain record suspensions. But they made that announcement after they changed their legislation, and that's the appropriate time for us to have that discussion. And until that takes place, and until the new system of cannabis control under Bill C-45 is enacted through Parliament and takes effect, we would urge all Canadians to continue to obey the laws that currently exist in this country until they are replaced with what we believe will be far more effective laws in ensuring that this is kept out of the hands of kids and not left up to criminals to produce and distribute.
Let's bring the angle of race into this if we can for a second, and I'll read an excerpt here from the Toronto Star, which says, "Black people with no history of criminal convictions have been 3 times more likely to be arrested by Toronto police for possession of small amounts of marijuana than white people with similar backgrounds," that according to a Toronto Star analysis. Are you concerned that with the increased severity of the penalties for distribution of cannabis outside the legal channels, that marginalized groups may continue to pay a higher price than others?
Well, actually, and one of the reasons we're bringing forward this legislation, I said it on the very first day we began to debate this in the House, that one of our concerns as a government is the disparate impact that the current system of cannabis control has on marginalized communities, poor communities, racialized communities, and Indigenous communities. And it's one of the reasons that motivates us is to take away the possibility of criminalizing the behavior of young people from all communities, but particularly from the ones that I've mentioned. And so that's one of the reasons we think we can create a far more effective regime of cannabis control and a far more just system by doing that. But I also want to be clear, we are replacing the criminal enterprise of illegal production and distribution of cannabis with a well-regulated system that is subject to oversight, rules, regulations, testing, accountability. And that is to ensure the health and safety of all of our citizens. So we're continuing to discourage and enforce the law to prevent illegal trafficking, because we think that's what's putting our kids at risk, what enriches organized crime, and we are currently under the current system. Organized crime is motivated only by profit and not by the well-being of our kids or the health of our citizens.
So should there be record suspensions for all the people currently in for pot possession?
Well, I believe that for people who have convictions on their records that are simple pot possession convictions and only simple pot possession convictions, that they should receive amnesty by way of a record suspension or actually a complete record deletion for those offenses. And in my view, this is a question of equality, because if we look at the disproportionate way in which marijuana-based offenses have been prosecuted in Canada, we know statistically that white Canadians and Canadians of color consume the substance at equal rates, but they are not charged and convicted at equal rates. So this is an issue that impacts communities, minority communities, communities of color, and in order to recognize the devastating impact that these kinds of measures have had on those communities, I think it's incumbent on the government to adopt that kind of approach going forward.
Can you tell us about, I've heard of this situation in Oakland, California, where they have a kind of a different program, reparations to those who have been criminalized by cannabis. How does that work?
Exactly. So in jurisdictions like Oakland, California, and I think there are some kind of reparation or preferential kind of treatment in other jurisdictions such as Los Angeles and Sacramento as well. It's primarily in California, but it stems from the idea and the recognition that in the historical prosecution of weed offenses, minority groups have been disproportionately criminalized. And in order to remedy that, Oakland, California has created or mandates that at least half of the business licenses that are going to weed businesses, so legal cannabis pot businesses, are going to be allocated for what they call marginalized or vulnerable groups. So specific identifiable groups such as people with cannabis records, in order to ameliorate and rectify the harm that such criminal records have caused for them.
We're not going to do that here.
There's no proposition on the part of the government to adopt that kind of measure, and I think that's troubling because it is a perpetuation of the idea that in the approach to cannabis legalization, the government has actually taken the same approach to cannabis decriminalization, which is that the impact on minority communities remains an afterthought.
Did you get a chance to talk to anybody in the federal government about this?
I have not personally spoken to anybody in the federal government about this.
Has this case been made to them, though?
I think that they are aware that there are rumblings about this. I know that there have been the bill is currently in its third reading. I know that throughout the history of the bill to date, there have been proposed amendments that raise things like, excuse me, that raise things like proposing an amnesty, and that has been done by the opposition party and the NDP. And so there is really an understanding or a knowledge or an awareness on the part of the government that this is in their radar, this is in their purview, and it's possible to do it.
But they've chosen not to so far.
They've chosen not to do so.
Okay. What do you believe to be the consequences of one social network like Facebook having such an utterly dominant position in our world today?
Well, if you asked Mark Zuckerberg that question, certainly a couple of years ago, he would have said, well, it's awesome. Everything is awesome about this because the more people who are connected, the more likely we are to solve all the great problems that face our planet. And his project for a while was to build a global community. That was one of his favorite phrases. And I think Silicon Valley generally believed that if we just connected everybody, that would be great. The shock horror revelation is that there are risks to very high levels of connectedness, that if you build a giant online social network of 2 billion plus people, it won't just be a venue for cat videos to be shared. What became clear in 2016 was that a networked world has some big downside risks. One of them, which I think is a very striking feature in the US, but I don't think it's uniquely US, is polarization. So people on large or even small social networks don't just congregate together in one big cluster. What tends to happen is a certain self-segregation. In the United States today, it's an ideological distinction. People who are liberals essentially share with people who are liberals, and conservatives do the same. And there's amazingly little traffic between these clusters. So one big problem that I think has arisen from the prevalence of online networks is the polarization that was already there in our political life is getting worse because the algorithm encourages us to hang out with people who are like-minded.
Stay in our echo chambers.
In the echo chamber, in the filter bubbles. I think that's one problem. I'll mention one more, which I think is very relevant to your viewers, and that is the way in which crazy stuff goes viral. There is no law that says only good things go viral. Actually, it turns out that quite often bad things are more likely to go viral because we're interested in fake news and in extreme views. So one thing that Facebook has turned out to be is a fantastic transmission mechanism for downright lies. And a good example was the story that the Pope had endorsed Donald Trump in 2016. People found that fascinating, perhaps understandably. There was only one problem. It was completely untrue. But by the time an idea like that has been shared between, well, probably not as many as 2 billion people, let's say 150 million, that is still potentially influential on an election outcome. Roughly the same number of people as voted in the US presidential election of 2016 saw fake news that was generated by the Russians. I mean, that's a staggering thought. That was not part of Mark Zuckerberg's plan when Facebook was set up. I'm pretty sure of that.
And yet we're sure it had no impact on the outcome of the election, right?
Well, I don't think it was decisive in the sense that, although that sounds like a big impact, when you measure the share of all the content on Facebook during the election that was accounted for by the Russians, it's tiny. Because content on Facebook is just mind-bogglingly voluminous. Billions and billions and billions of things get shared on Facebook in the space of a year.
But you never know what's influential.
Right, but we can see that in that extraordinary period around Donald Trump's rise to power, although the Russians were certainly playing in the Facebook space. They were a relatively small part of what was being generated. Most of the content, including most of the fake news, was domestic in origin. It was being generated by ordinary American users of Facebook. So I think what we should realize here is not that the Russians decided the election, I think that goes too far, but that Facebook was decisive. No Facebook, no Trump. Without Facebook, I'm pretty sure he could not have won that election. People tend to emphasize his Twitter feed. It was the campaign's use of Facebook's advertising tools that really decided the outcome. And the Clinton campaign, by comparison, was flat-footed, didn't understand the power of Facebook advertising. And I think one of the most important things we all have to understand, Canadians as well as Americans, Brits too, indeed anybody in any democracy, is that the Facebook advertising tool is now the most powerful weapon in any election campaign.
You call it a weapon.
It is a weapon.
Interesting choice of words.
Absolutely. It's a much more powerful weapon than television advertising because it's so precise and it gives you instant feedback. You can tell which adverts are hitting which demographic most effectively. This was very obvious in the Brexit campaign, which preceded Trump's victory. The Leave campaign, the anti-European campaign, understood the Facebook tool and it was able to calibrate its advertising, target its advertising at the people that it really wanted to influence. And I think this is a much more powerful weapon in politics than people generally appreciate. Though, believe me, they get it at Facebook because they realized, wow, we can make a lot of money from this kind of advertising. I think this has changed the public sphere. The place where ideas are exchanged has been irrevocably altered by the emergence of giant online social networks. And I don't think we fully comprehend how big that change is.
Shall we do an excerpt from the book?
By all means.
Let's. Sheldon, bring this excerpt up, if you would. Here's what you have to say about this. Facebook promised to create an interconnected world of netizens, but its structure was profoundly inegalitarian. Facebook has 15,724 employees and close to 2 billion users, but only the tiniest fractions of these groups actually own Facebook stock. The global social network, in other words, is itself owned by an exclusive network of Silicon Valley insiders. That does sound nefarious. Do you mean it to?
Well, again, it's not nefarious. They didn't set out to achieve this, but the reality of the way that these network platforms have evolved is that they quickly become quasi-monopolies. I mean, there's no other social network that can compete with Facebook. The MySpaces are forgotten. And because they're relatively easy to run, they don't require the employees that General Motors require. They're quite small. The money that flows in from online advertising is mind-blowing. We're talking billions every quarter. And the founder, of course, has a pretty large share of the equity. It's not like Zuckerberg is about to do a full Andrew Carnegie and give it all away. So the reality is that like Google, because in this Facebook is far from unique, like Amazon, the founder has an enormous stake of an incredibly valuable company, one of the most valuable companies in the world. And yet we all kind of believe that Facebook has made the world flatter. I think that's one of the great illusions of the networked world, that we're all netizens, we all somehow have equal access, we can all speak truth to power. Yeah, but when you look at the network structure, it's not egalitarian at all. A few people have crazy numbers of connections. Look at how many followers Donald Trump has compared with little old us. And more importantly, a very few people own a really huge chunk of the infrastructure of the online social networks.
When you typically, let's say, bring down a budget in the province of Ontario, how much awareness would there be in the general population for what's in that budget?
Less than half.
What did you find in terms of what percentage of people were aware of what was going on with the PC party these days?
92% had heard something about it before the poll.
Is that unusually high?
I've never seen anything that high. I mean, we look at real life events as well. And the only thing I've ever seen that was close to that was 2002, the silver medal controversy when Canadian figure skaters clearly skated the best program, but only got a silver.
Oh, yes, yes. Remember that. Okay. That was the Olympics, wasn't it?
Yeah, yeah, and they ended up getting a gold.
Right, right. Okay, so this is, people are aware of this story in a very large number. And yet, we're going to show a bunch of charts here from your work, and here's one of the things that I found fascinating. Let's do the first one here, Sheldon. Here's how the vote changed, from before the controversy to after the controversy, And it barely changed at all, Greg.
Right. I mean, there's no significant change in Liberal or Tory support. The NDP is up a few points. They're up 4 points, and that is statistically significant when you compare the two samples. And that came mostly from undecideds and mostly from women.
Have you got a theory as to why such a cataclysmic bomb could be dropped on a party and basically nothing changes?
Right. Well, the first thing that we did is we asked questions about the parties so that we didn't prime the consideration. And then following those sort of questions, we then said, have you seen anything about this controversy? Do you think it could happen to, is it a Tory sort of thing, or could it happen to any party? How do you think the Tories responded? And essentially what we saw is, number one, this is a moment. So for a brief moment, people that normally don't pay a lot of attention to politics tuned in. And what they saw was something that they felt could have happened to any party, not just the Tories, and something where they thought overall, as of a week ago, that the Tories had responded well to it.
We actually have a graphic here that indicates that. Let's do that one, Sheldon. Here's your pie chart. And when asked, is this a particular problem for the Progressive Conservatives Party, or could this happen to anybody? You got 3/4 of people saying that this could have happened anywhere.
Right, and the ones that are in the small group that say it's likely a Tory thing are people that don't look like they're very likely to vote Tory anyhow.
So in terms of, will this scandal potentially affect the vote on Election Day, seems to be the answer is no.
At the moment.
At the moment, right.
Right, because it's brought issues to the front that we'll see how they play out.
Take us through this next chart here. This is vote loyalty segmentation. And you've got here, I'll just show it to you here. There it is up there right now. Take us through what's important to see in this chart.
Well, essentially what we did in the survey is at the end of the survey, at the start we ask vote, it's the very first thing that we do so that we're not priming other considerations. But then at the end of the survey, where we've talked about the fact that Patrick Brown has gone and we've raised the list of 9 names of people that might run, we then asked the vote again, but this time we did it with leader attached. So we'd say in the next election, there'll be a new Tory leader. If the new Tory leader is fill in the blank, how likely would you be to vote for fill in the blanks PCs, Kathleen Wynne's Liberals, Andrea Horwath's NDPs, and we rotated that so that it was randomized. And what we found was something that really surprised me. We found that both the Liberals and the Tories had their vote go down and all those voters go to undecided. The NDP, however, stayed firm. And so that's saying a couple of things that are really interesting. One is that the people that are currently New Democrat aren't going to change their mind. They're not really interested in the Tories. It won't make a difference to them. The Liberals have the potential to pull some Tories over to their side, right? Because a bunch of Tories are saying that people that are Tory today are saying whether I stay Tory or not depends on who the Tories elect.
So this next convention is key.
Well, but the scary thing for the Liberals is that just as many, in fact, even a few more people that are currently Liberal went on the fence and said whether I stay Liberal or not depends on who the Tories elect.
So potential Liberal voters may be potential Conservative voters depending on who the Tories pick.
Exactly. And so, yes, this opens the door for the Liberals to be able to pull the Tories down and to find a way back into office. But by the same token, they could be even worse than they are today if the Tories are able to pull some of those Liberals back over.
And you were surprised to find this?
Normally what we find when we do a trial ballot like this is, if anything, people stay about the same, undecided doesn't grow, and some leaders pop as being more popular than others, right? So we just had that situation happen in BC with the BC Liberal leadership race, and there were important differences. In this one, basically, it didn't really matter who the leader was. In all the cases, people said, I'm just going to sit back and wait. I've got new information to consider. And what that does is that it makes the race a lot closer and makes the NDP more competitive than they look in other types of ways of doing the vote question than we would normally see. And so you now have a plausible scenario, not necessarily a likely scenario, but a plausible scenario where the NDP could actually move into government. More likely scenarios where either the Liberals are able to hold on or the Tories are able to replace them.
So you see potentially, I mean, let's reinforce the point where
it's all potential.
Between 4 and 5 months still to go till Election Day. Am I inferring that you're seeing maybe 4 or 5 different scenarios for Election Day?
Very much so. It seems at this point relatively unlikely that the Liberals would be able to win another majority. To do that, there'd have to be a Tory that the public was very scared about. with some scary policies. But whether it's a minority or not, I think is very much up in the air. And whether the Tories could pull out quite a large majority, again, depends on how the public reacts to the new leader. But it's open to a large majority.
Well, so far, you've got the public approving as opposed to disapproving of the way the PC party has handled all of the scandalous news of the past week and a half or so by a 2-to-1 margin. And again, as you're looking for surprises out there, how big a one was that?
Well, typically what happens is that we look at the world based on our partisanship. So what I was expecting to see is what we usually see, which is that Liberals would disapprove of the jobs the Tory had done, New Democrats, Greens would disapprove of the job the Tories had done. And what we saw in this is that people put their partisan lenses aside when they were making those judgments. So that was quite a big surprise.
And that is the Agenda's Week in Review for this Friday, February 9th, 2018. You can see all of those conversations in their entirety. They're on our website at tvo.org, on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, and thanks to our nightly Twitter live stream on our Periscope page. That's periscope.tv/theagenda.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. Helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.